end, what separates a man from a slave? Money? Power? No. A man chooses. A slave obeys.
Yes, time to manipulate my audience into watching a video about manipulators in media, and how to do them right and wrong, subtly instilling my own preferences into you all and warping the internet to be like me. Nah, I'm not that great of a manipulator, and I don't want to be, maybe. Though if you want to support me on Patreon, I could be one day. Well, either that or make a pretty cool video game, who knows. But a while ago, we talked about manipulative villains on the channel, and to be fair, I want to point out it's not just villains who can be manipulators. And while we will be talking about antagonists in this video, we'll also be talking about protagonist characters as well that can be quite manipulative. Because even people we're supposed to root for can mess with people like chess pieces on a checkers board. So hi, I'm MangaKamen, and let's begin.
I didn't even know the victim who passed away. I never seen her before, or her red handkerchief. Red handkerchief, you said. Don't you fucking dare. Objection!
Ace Attorney is one of my favorite series of video games of all time. It's a series that I grew up with, and while I'm glad we finally got ourselves a few of the games that weren't available in the West for years, Capcom sure as hell took its sweet time to get them over here. So, when you really think about it, almost every villain in the series is a manipulative bastard, since they're doing what they can to put the blame of their crimes on other people. From the ones that throw their toupees into lawyers' faces, to people who honestly feel like they should be saying, "Hello, Internet, welcome to..." So, you could easily select a character from any of the multiple games to put in a video like this, but for the sake of shaking things up, let's talk about one of the most surprising manipulative characters in the series, Phoenix Wright himself. Oh, wait, I think we have the wrong outfit here. Ah, there we go. That's the manipulative hobo that we all know and love. If you're not familiar with this lovable hobo, this was during the time when Phoenix Wright had lost his attorney status. It was when the first Apollo Justice game dropped. Phoenix, after being disbarred for using fake evidence in a courtroom, had to do something, especially when we entered into the dark age of the law. And that's when his plan began to formulate in that beanie-covered brain of his. But I think it's important to understand that before we dive into this, we need to establish a few things about Phoenix Wright and how he is a manipulative character. One with good intentions, mind you, and wants to make things right, but he's still a puppet master of sorts. Even in the first game, in Turnabout Samurai, Phoenix puts the spotlight of suspicion on Wendy Oldbag. An annoying character, mind you, but he did this not to actually throw the blame onto his client onto her, but to buy an additional day of investigation and trial. All the while, this would turn an innocent person into a suspect because this is for... Phoenix was right. I mean, Phoenix was correct in what he did, as he did find the true culprit afterwards. But another instance would be from the next game, from the final trial where both Phoenix and the prosecutor Miles Edgeworth would attack a witness's character and varying degrees of intrusion on her mental health, which she had a history of some... nasty extremes. Again though, they did this in order to get the actual culprit, who Phoenix was not only defending at the time, but was also being blackmailed with the life of his friend Maya on the line. It was a means of manipulation that was again for... Or even the third game with a turnabout recipe, where Phoenix, lacking the actual evidence to convict the true culprit, who was a badly tanned Phoenix Light lookalike, had to manipulate what evidence he had, presenting a bottle containing the victim's ear medicine and claiming it was the poison used to kill him. The culprit, being cocky, claimed that it wasn't the bottle, and had to describe what the actual poison bottle was, something that the culprit wouldn't have known if he wasn't the killer. I think it's safe to say Phoenix is actually quite the mental maneuverer. And of course, there's a good reason, since he does prove that the people he manipulates are criminals who have taken the lives of others. It's done in the service of... the greater good. But I went down memory lane with these examples to showcase that Phoenix isn't above using manipulative tactics for the sake of his clients, mainly because there were some people who claim that the actions that I'm about to describe are out of character from Phoenix. Because, let's face it, one of the major elements of the Ace Attorney series is the criticism of the legal system, and sometimes just playing by the rules isn't going to work. because there are going to be jokers out there who are going to be twisting the system to their advantage because the rules can be circumvented for selfish reasons. It's how Phoenix goes about it that makes him an interesting character in that regard though. And after 7 years of being set up with fake evidence, it's no wonder that while having a snide and mysterious side, he'd do something similar in Apollo Justice. If you're not familiar with the story of Apollo Justice, most notably the first and last trial, the first trial has us defending the hobo who's got a love for grape juice and is unusually really good at playing poker. Having been accused of murder, the trial does what the trial does, and it turns out that our mentor, Christoph Gavin, was the real culprit. There's a problem though. In order to prove that, Apollo, the new player character, had to present false evidence. He didn't know it was false until after the trial, but it was Phoenix Wright who had it forged. And then later on, Phoenix Wright continues to play the manipulator in the legal system by selecting a case in order to reform the legal system to create a juris system. As stated by Christoph, evidence is everything. There's nothing more. It's a means of showcasing how an evidence-only approach to law is broken, especially in both cases, the real culprit, Christoph, used the law's dependence on evidence to protect himself, and the only way to expose his crimes was to cheat or change the rules of the entire system. So in order to do that, Phoenix Wright had to manipulate things to showcase the flaws in the legal system, not just in the first trial of Apollo Justice by manipulating the evidence, but even the player's perception. But even then, in the final case where Phoenix did the following: creating illegal evidence to tie Christoph to the murder, collect video evidence to show to the jury since it can't be submitted to the court, and conduct the trial that would be determined the effectiveness of the juris system, and made a case that he had a very big connection to, since the evidence that got him disbarred was made by the victim and the culprit was Christoph. In the end, it's us the players, or the jurists, to determine if we believe the evidence, real or fake, is enough to condemn the accused in that case. But it should be known that Phoenix Wright throughout this is showing the evidence and footage for 7 years, put into the Mason system for the jurors to view, and acting as a guide throughout it, providing a small segment after each Mason system location segment, colored in his own biases. Hell, even Phoenix himself states that he was in charge of what the jurors saw, and he showed this same information to Apollo in hopes that it would get Christoph to be dragged back to the courtroom one more time. And it all worked. Now, you can easily say this could have been done in convenience, and I'm not gonna lie, it does have a few hints of that here and there. But to me, it shows that Phoenix Wright is a manipulative character and one that is on for the side of good. And I think it fits him too, especially if we consider his past. Most people in Phoenix Wright and Ace Attorney fan spaces are well aware of the events of what put Phoenix on the road to becoming an attorney. And that was the initial class trial where he was accused of stealing someone's money, and that someone, being Miles Edgeworth, stood up in his defense. Then there was also Larry Butts, who actually stole the money and also defended him, but that's a whole other thing. When something smells, it's usually the butts. But it was because of that trial that Phoenix saw the law should be used to help people who were wrongly accused. It's always about helping good people and finding the bad ones who did the horrible action. In the original trilogy, Phoenix was an emotional guy, willing to believe his clients even to a fault. It's why this turn when Phoenix follows his ideals to become a more extreme method, because while I did bring up examples of Phoenix having to manipulate situations in order to help his clients, they weren't technically breaking the rules. Hell, the bottle of poison one wasn't actually being presented to the court, but the culprit instead. It's a moral gray area, but it's still within Phoenix's morals, especially since he did get the right people in jail and kept the innocent out. It's just that his manipulative tendencies got a bit more outlandish and extreme, especially when he was pushed out of the attorney seat. One could even say he became tunnel vision in order to rebuild the broken justice system. But the point for this is to show that you can make a protagonistic character as a manipulator. And I like to think that Phoenix Wright, though breaking the rules, is a good example of that, since he's willing to use these tactics that can trick his opponents and help his clients. Good thing he's one of the few good attorneys out there. Otherwise, that power might be used to make some new autopsy reports.
I, Lelouch V. Britannia, command you. Now all of you, die!
When it comes to manipulators, I'm going to be honest. I prefer the kinds of puppet masters who don't rely on supernatural elements to get their puppet strings hooked into someone. That's because when you have something like mind control or power similar to that, it doesn't come off as real manipulation. I personally prefer when manipulative characters use their intellect or what they know about the other characters to force them to do what they want them to, because it still has the inkling that they made the person do what they wanted, but they did it of their own free will. Having something like mind control doesn't really make you out to be an effective manipulator to me. It comes off as more as a crutch for the character, especially if it's used in place of getting a person's head and making them do what benefits you. Now, as I said, This is just my preference, and there are tons of caveats to this. Because, for example, it depends on how the power itself works, if there are limitations, if those limitations are utilized or not, and etc. It's why when we look at two of anime's most premier protagonists who are not only classified as manipulators, but also have supernatural abilities that had distinct limitations, it makes it hard for me to say they're bad or good at the same time, but are at very least good to discuss this point. I am of course referring to Light Yagami from Death Note and Lelouch Lamperouge from Code Geass. If you're not familiar with either of these characters, or you're not a weeb like me, let me give you a quick summary. Light Yagami was a regular high school student who was at the top of his class with grades, and he's bored with life, at least until he comes across a weird notebook called the Death Note, and he learns that whoever's name is written in the notebook will die. After testing it out, he learns that it's true. And with the Shinigami Ryuk at his side, Light intends to remove all crime and evil from the world. All the while, Ryuk sees him as a piece of entertainment. I mean, maybe this was the live-action version. Lelouch Lamperouge is a high school student who was once a former prince in an alternate version of our world where the British Empire and Britannia took over the world. After his mother was killed and his sister crippled, Lelouch vowed to get revenge against the Empire and his father. It wouldn't be years later that he met C2, a mysterious girl who gave him the power of a Geass, an ability that differs between those who have it. But Lelouch's Geass allows him to command anyone to do whatever he pleases, even having them kill themselves. Now, both of their powers give them advantages over the regular everyday person, but they come with some very serious restrictions. With the Death Note, Light has about... well, there are a lot of rules. Some of them are actually written in the book by the Shinigami Ryuk, but there are a lot of things about the tool that Ryuk himself didn't know or realize. Plus, there's the How to Use editions in the manga volumes and anime that explain the finer details that Light discovered. Just an example, exchanging and writing on a death note between gods of death is not a problem. It's not a rule per se, but a clarification. With Lelouch's Geass, there isn't a written down tutorial or such, so he has to rely on experimentation. One of the biggest things is that he can only use the power on a person once. And while I will say that with limitations like these, and many more, it can make the use of superpowers to be tolerable in my opinion, especially when you consider that these two have to hide their identities while using their powers, otherwise they could get killed. However, that doesn't really mean that it makes them all the greatest of manipulators. Let's consider Lelouch when he first gets his power. Now, I'm not saying that this doesn't make sense. The kid was about to be killed and he's using those powers to make sure he survives. Sure, it's a little eyebrow raising that he knows he can do this since that's his first use of the Geass, but for the sake of suspension of disbelief, it's not a big deal. The actual issue comes up next.
Now then, hand your nightmare over to me.
Understood.
So, hold up! Why is she allowed to live? If the goal was to get the nightmare frame, he could have ordered her to kill herself, and he'd still get the keys. Now, there's a simple response to that. There's a code that's needed for it. It's brought up easily in the anime, and my question is, how would Lelouch know that? And another question is, why would he let Valletta live? He just got the power and he doesn't know that those who are affected by his Geass have temporary amnesia. For all Lelouch knows, the moment that Valletta gives him the keys, she'd be released from his power and shoot him for holding onto her nightmare key. If he did know, then it raises the question of why experiment with that. And considering that Lelouch just killed dozens of Britannia soldiers, why leave her alive? Plot. All for the plot, baby. The problem I have with Lelouch as a manipulative character is that there are times where the plot is also bent over to make him smarter or to make his plans work. Add a bit of convenience to the plot as well, it lowers his status of a manipulator in my eyes. A little bit, since he is a manipulator and he is relatively smart, but sometimes the convenience is also set to work against him. Using Valletta as an example again, later in the show, she investigates Geass and actually catches Lelouch as the leader of a rebellious force. He would have died then, but the girl who had a crush on him was there and shot Valletta. Hooray! But let's consider Light an example, because I'm sure there are people who can make a similar argument for the character. But here's the thing, unlike Lelouch, whose power is something that needs to be done 1 in person to use, and 2, is often used under stress, the Death Note normally doesn't have that same element of restriction to it. Light will often take time to plan out his own ideas and articulate how to use the Death Note, and people too. It feels a lot more manipulative since he's taking advantage of people and using the Shinigami to his advantage. Now, don't get me wrong, Death Note has its issues with writing as well, especially with convenience.
Think about it. You got on that bus because you were investigating someone, right? And now you're telling me that this criminal is most likely dead. Doesn't that suggest that you...
That's enough. Look, darling, you and I know you used to be one of the best agents in the FBI. But now you're my fiancé, Naomi. We talked about this.
Ah, yes. Using sexism to deflect the plot hole. But my point is that depending on how you look at it, these two characters do have to rely on their powers to be effective manipulators. But that's not the problem. The problem I have is that convenience and inconsistency are the proverbial spanners in the works that make it hard for me to like them as manipulators fully, because it feels like they're manipulating the plot itself and not just the characters within it. That isn't to say that they're bad characters or their stories are bad, just my issues with them as manipulative characters. I still think they're both decent examples, but there are little kinks in their armor that I do have to point out. Of course, when compared to the next character I want to talk about, well, at least their potential as manipulators was utilized and not cheapened, for the most part.
So beautiful. Your lovely faces, eroded by despair, have come together as one.
When I first did this video topic a few years ago, there was one character who I talked about that more than likely I'm using her in the thumbnail of this video. What can I say? She sells views. She was a major villain in the first two games, an anime continuation of the series' story, and in the first two games, the character had really a lot of potential as a manipulative character. I mean, you'd have to be in order to convince people to kill each other, and to have a whole class of people join your side to create nothing but despair in the world. At least until it was retconned into brainwashing. Yes, my friends, we're talking about Junko Enoshima.
Hold on your butts, people, because Junko Enoshima is ready for her epic entrance! Kamakura, yes, queen! Brace despair and we'll shatter the glass together! I am your salvation!
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
Listen, I know I used her as a prominent negative example in my first iteration of this video, but I can't help but bring her up again because, frankly, I find the use of her character to be a fascinating idea, and then watching it become all slapdash is something worth talking about. If you're not familiar with the story of Danganronpa, there's a private school that searches out very talented people, Hope's Peak Academy, where the talents of people get to go to get nurtured. Some talents are practical, such as computer expert or cook. Others are, well, out there, like delinquent or mafia boss. Yeah, those talents really need to be nurtured. But along comes Junko Enoshima, a girl with a fascination with despair and wishes to instill it into the entire world itself. So after brainwashing a whole class of ultimate students who become the embodiments of despair, Junko was able to get her dream to come true. However, there was another class of students that managed to escape the carnage, which she just so happened to be a part of. So she erased their memories of everything, decided to pit them in a killing game just to keep the despair a-going. I should be upfront that Danganronpa isn't exactly a series you're supposed to take seriously. I mean, there's a reason why the blood is pink, and almost every execution in the game is over the top. It's meant to be a goofy mystery story with over-the-top designs, story beats, and etc. And that's perfectly fine. It's to establish your expectations in suspension of disbelief are supposed to be set to a certain level. I mean, we've got a robotic bear who seemingly has the power to pull off these executions running amok. But I do need to point out, as the writer of the series Kodaka, he had the intention of making a villain who wasn't sympathetic. As stated in an interview on the matter, "Recently, I feel like more bad guys in games are given a harsh background of some kind that explains their evilness in the present day, but that feels like cheating to me. I felt the most dangerous thing about Junko would be that she doesn't have any reason to do the things she does, so I incorporated that into her character all the way through the game as thoroughly as possible." I can appreciate that. I don't think every villainous character needs to have a sympathetic backstory, so that's cool. But that's not really the topic of this video now, is it? No, it's discussing Junko as a manipulator. And in the first game, aside from the whole memory wiping thing, I did appreciate how Junko was able to basically manipulate the entire fears, thoughts, and motivations of the characters to commit horrible acts. Even in the first trial, using things such as showing their loved ones being abducted or could have been killed in the process, threatened to expose some secrets, and all that stuff was typically things you see a manipulator do. Now, when it comes to blackmailing and threatening characters, I can see an argument being made that isn't exactly the same as manipulation, since it's pretty much coercing someone to do something they don't want to do. In this case, murder! Okay then, but I do disagree with that notion. We can argue about the merits of manipulative tendencies in that regard, but I do find it to be a form of manipulation since you're still having the person act outside how they normally would. And in that regard, I think to some degree, Junko is a decent manipulator, since she does her homework on these characters and is preying on the weaknesses of them to do what she wants them to do. Then we get to the sequel, Danganronpa 2. While there's that whole standard fare to manipulate the cast to do what she wants, there was another layer coated onto the idea of manipulation. That Junko managed to convince this class that despair was the way to go, and become her followers, which led them doing some really messed up shit that I sure as hell ain't gonna go into. Not on this channel, this is a good Christian channel, damn it! Point is, while it wasn't explicitly stated in the game how she did it, Junko managed to convince a large group of people to join her side, manipulating them to do horrible acts because of her charisma. It made the character a lot more interesting and allowed people to theorize how she could have pulled this off to radicalize so many people. And then the anime happened, and it turned out that she tricked an animator to make a brainwashing animation, and then brainwash every remnant of despair. Woo! Look, I already stated in this video that when it comes to mind control, I'm a little on the fence of it being used as manipulation because depending on how it's done and if there are any restrictions to it, it can work. But with this, it comes off more as a rushed excuse and doesn't really do anything to expand upon the manipulative side of Junko, save for tricking the kid to make the animation in the first place. Not only that, but it also does a lot more than just that. Not only does it cut out the possibility of Junko being a manipulative bitch, but also remove the agency and consequences of the people who were being controlled by her. After all, it was done against their will, and they couldn't really help themselves. This is why I have an issue with the whole mind control aspect of manipulators, since frankly speaking, it becomes a lot more boring. In Danganronpa 2, it was shown that each and every one of the characters who would become the remnants of despair, mind you, all had varying degrees of personal trauma, and there were implications that Junko had preyed on those vulnerable abilities to indoctrinate them to becoming her followers. And this also undermines the whole theme of the original game, which had a really big emphasis on choosing your own future, but that choice being made for you isn't really conducive to that now, is it? To be fair, if the path of taking each character one by one and converting them into the big old balls of despair they were going to become, there have been some arguments against that, since there are some characters who honestly don't have as much trouble as the others, and that's a valid point, though I would argue that this is kind of the issue to this as well, since the path of the brainwashing video kneecapped the possibility of diving deeper into the characters' backstories and seeing what could have led them to become remnants of despair. You don't need to have a super tragic backstory to manipulate someone, because manipulation can come in many different forms. It doesn't have to prey on a character's tragic backstory, it can prey on someone who just wants to be appreciated. It can prey on someone's family situation. It can prey on someone who's a fish out of water. It makes your characters human who have their insecurities, their fears, and their woes. That's what a manipulative character does in order to make people do what they want them to do. They prey on whatever little weakness someone has, offers them a solution, and effectively makes them do things they wouldn't want to because of said insecurities, and because one person, even if they're bad, was willing to accept them. Using mind control just doesn't have that same oomph, and that's why I feel like Junko is a terrible example of a manipulator because it just makes it lazy. Hell, even love can be used as manipulation, which brings us to our next subject. I think having love as a target for manipulation is one thing that a lot of us can at the very least understand. After all, there has to be someone in the world that you care so much about that you'd be willing to do anything for them. Love is a powerful emotion, and can also be used as a powerful tool. So in that regard, Super Paper Mario! This game is a bit of an odd duck for the Paper Mario series, mainly because this was the title that took a real drastic turn from the convention of the previous two titles. And this caused a bit of a snafu with the fanbase, and they have broken away from the RPG-based gameplay mechanics. But nowadays, a lot of people have warmed up to the game. Not hard to do when there's a new punching bag in town. So why do I bring up the topic of love with this? Well, simple my friends, it's because love is a very dominant theme and motivator for a lot of the characters. You only need to look at the prominent villain of the game, Count Bleck, a man whose motivation for the events is based on the grief over his lost love, and 3 of his 4 minions, Mimi, Ochunks, and Nastasia, all have the drive to support him based out of unconditional love. Of course, most people who are familiar with the game will notice one name that I didn't bring up there, and he's obviously the character I'm going to be talking about for this section. Yep. We're talking about Dementio. Yes, this cute little jester who turns out to be a bastard. He's more than meets the eye and ultimately becomes the big bad of the game, where he manipulates not only evil villains but also the player as well. But let's go a little bit into how he manipulates. The first is how he goes about by performing a bit of a facade, where he joins up with Count Bleck, who has the goal of destroying the world and even all universes with a power called the Chaos Heart. Turns out Count Bleck is doing this because he lost his fiancée, and the despair of the loss turned him into a bit of a suicidal doomsdayer. Of course, Bleck told his allies that his goal was to reform the worlds, but it should point out that it's also a possibility that Bleck was corrupted by the Dark Prognosticus. As hinted at when he opens it, Count Bleck refuses to refer to his old name. Where Dementio comes into play, though, is he starts off as Bleck's minion. A bit of a goofball and doing childish things, like in his first scene where he reads Mimi's diary, making light of the hunky lifeguards. It's just immature. And when you fight him early on in the third chapter, he doesn't really come off as that threatening. In fact, Dementio's boss fight isn't all that difficult, as his attacks aren't really all that hard to dodge. And we do see him saying things later on that he believes that Mario and the party he carries to be the one to defeat Count Bleck. But when Chapter 5 comes around, he begins to show his exploitative side by using the loyalty that Ochunks has for Count Bleck by playing him like a violin to be part of an experiment for the Floro Sprout, which, for clarification, is a means of mind-controlling someone. So is willing to use the admiration for Count Bleck to have Ochunks act as a guinea pig for future endeavors. Another example would be when he subtly suggests an attack could be launched against Mario as a surprise, and a brainwashed Luigi going by the name Mr. L does so, which unfortunately was a part of Dementio's plan to have Mr. L be separated from Count Bleck's team. And Dementio sends him to the Underwear, which is essentially the afterlife of the Paper Mario world. Oh, and then he sends the rest of the player team to the Underwear, which is also to put the Mario crew on the right path to Count Bleck's hideout. Now, this isn't the greatest form of manipulation, but is Dementio doing all he can to get all the pieces on the board so he can take the Chaos Heart for himself, and has actually been working to help the Mario crew, doing things like removing Luigi's brainwashing and reuniting him with Mario, protecting Princess Peach, and reveals that Count Bleck's true motives for the utter ruin of the universes. This is to trick Mario and friends into quote-unquote teaming up. And if you choose to join him, well, you get a bad ending with Dementio implanting Floro Sprouts in Mario and Luigi, basically making him the actual controller now. Well, even if you say no, that still has you playing in Dementio's hands, since when you defeat Count Bleck, he swoops in, takes the Chaos Heart for himself, and also reveals that he infected Luigi with the Floro Sprout anyway to have him become a puppet and create Super Dementio! To be frank, Dementio is a bit of a fun villain and would often play both sides of the conflict, only for him to ultimately sweep the rug out from both parties and take what he wants. It's a good manipulative nature for a villain, even more so for a game like Super Paper Mario, and I feel like Dementio is an effective manipulator, if not a simple example of one. And while he does have brainwashing tendencies, a lot of his manipulation comes from his words and actions and playing both sides, not so much his powers to force people into doing things until he actually needs them to, so props for that. I want to end this video with one final example, and another one that comes from the good old folks from Capcom. Sorry, not gonna do that one. Look, as much as I think Albert Wesker is a decent manipulator, I'm not too keen on some choices in the writing of Resident Evil, especially with the RE3 remake thoughts that will be drowning it out. Get that friggin' nose off Nemesis already! But no, I'd rather talk about another game from Capcom, which, funnily enough, since we started this video with the Ace Attorney, it's only appropriate that we end this from the same mind that made that series. Shu Takumi's Ghost Trick. The game where you die, become a ghost, possess things, and try to solve your own murder. And I'm going to give you guys one last chance to skip this chapter since I'm going to be spoiling pretty much everything about this game. So with those draw tablets, drop the pens, pick up the mouse, and skip to the final chapter because, yes, I am in your walls.
He's in the walls.
He's in the goddamn wall!
And with that joke out of the way, let's talk about the greatest manipulator in the game. You see in Ghost Trick, there are a number of incidents caused by one man, and that would be the central antagonist Yomiel, a man who has the actual body and the soul of the cover art character that we play, and for whom most of the game we believe we are. He's the one who caused all the events of the game, with his tragic backstory where all he wanted was a chance at a new family, even if a fake one. You see, 10 years before the story of Ghost Trick begins, there was a meteor that crashed into Yomiel's back. It killed him, but it also gave him ghost powers that allowed him to possess things and manipulate them at will. will. When he was able to get his body back, which still contained the meteor, Yomiel learned that his lover had passed away, and he only sought one thing: revenge and have a false life. He is not who I am talking about. But I need to bring him up to set the groundwork. You see, early in the story, we're introduced to a character who gives us the lowdown on what we are and how our ghost tricks work. And as it turns out to be... a lamp. Yes, my friends. This is the greatest manipulator in the game. And it's done in a very subtle way, as he informs us of two important things that set us on the path: a lead about our lost memories and a time limit. In this case, following the detective Lin and telling us that we will fade away from existence at the first crack of dawn. Which, the second one was a lie, so we wouldn't waste our time. And to be fair, this actually worked. Because not only because of this manipulation did we manage to save a lot of people who would have otherwise been destined to die tonight, we went back and saved Yomiel, the man who caused a lot of the turmoil that this would cause, and made it so he would still be alive and no longer have his ghost powers. But who is this lamp? Who is Ray? Why does he lie to the protagonist to get him to save the day? Well, as it turns out, it's Shu Takumi's dog, Missile. Yes, my friends, in my opinion, one of the best manipulators in gaming is a dog. A very loyal dog who's a good boy. Someone who's loyal to his owner Lin and is willing to wait 10 years to save his master, because that's what good doggies do. In the first iteration of the night, Missile was killed in the presence of Yomiel, and as such, the meteor in Yomiel's body awakened Missile's ghostly powers. And while it's a simple motivation, it is at the core of Ghost Trick the reason why we even have a story in the first place. And all it took was putting the protagonist Cecil on the right path and warning him that he would fade away from existence if he wasted too much time. To me, if that's all it takes to manipulate not only the main character, but then in turn manipulate pretty much everyone else in the cast as a domino effect, that is a masterclass of manipulation. Sure, it's for the shut it! But that doesn't make Missile any less of a manipulator. In fact, it makes him even a better one, and one who uses his abilities to manipulate for the power of good. Whether it's for good or bad, manipulative characters are a staple of modern day media because they can act as a really good twist character. And there's a reason why I decided to focus more on general manipulators and not just villains for this version of the video. That's because manipulation isn't a tactic available just to villains. And I know that's a pretty big, well, duh, Kamen. But we really need to think about it, as when you consider how villains and heroes are often depicted, manipulation is more of an underhanded tactic, and as such, it's not normally something you would see heroic or protagonistic characters use in their roster of abilities. Don't get me wrong, I think that's fine to have that belief, but I think it's a bit too rigid to just put one tactic in such a box. As I've expressed, manipulation can be used for negative or positive outcomes. It really all depends on what it's being used for and how it's being used that makes manipulation work that way. But hey, that's just my view on the matter. What do you guys think? What are some manipulative characters you think use the tactic for good? What are manipulative characters you think that use the tactic for bad? Let me know down in the comments below, that's what they're there for. And by the way, don't bother liking this video, because I know that it's just standard fare for YouTubers to bring that up, but I appreciate you watching. In any case, I'm MangaKamen. Thank you for giving me your time, and later.